Hello, what a fantastic past hour we've just had. We've been talking about the visual arts, we've been talking about gaming, and now we're going to move on to literature. My name is Alice Thwaite. I'm your MC for this evening, and I'm a tech philosopher and ethicist. I run a tech ethics consultancy and academy, and I also am the founder of the Echo Chamber Club. The Createch stage is possibly one of the most important stages at CogX because creativity culture helps us understand our relationship with others and ourselves. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Molly Rosenberg for this next session, where we're going to be talking about science fiction's relationship with reality. Are we currently living through fiction, as so many people are currently saying? Molly, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Alice. And I just wanted to say that we're thrilled that the RSL has partnered for the first time with CogX. This year, the RSL turns 200, and we're taking this time to look forward to the future of literature and technology, as well as back through 2 centuries of the UK's literary history. This evening's discussion is going to examine this strange, unusual, dare I say, unprecedented moment. And as Alice said, looking at whether we are living through the various fictions we've imagined now, how the internet and AI have transformed the way we read and what we look for in literature, and whether the internet and fiction can fight oppression to set a new future. Huge thanks to our brilliant chair for this evening, Kate Pullinger, for being here with us after Martha Lane Fox unfortunately was unable to chair tonight. Kate writes for both print and digital platforms, and if you haven't read her most recent digital fiction, Breathe, which is a ghost story that knows where you are, and I've read and successfully freaked me out, that's available for free on your phone, and we'll try to put a link somewhere so that you can have a link to that later on in the session. Kate is also Professor of Creative Writing and Digital Media at Bath Spa University, where she is Director of the Centre for Research in the Cultural and Creative Industries. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I'm sure I will.
Thanks, Molly. Yeah, hopefully we'll have a really fruitful discussion here. I'd like to introduce Charlotte and Temi. Temi O studied neuroscience at King's College London before going on to do her MA in creative writing at Edinburgh University. While she was an undergraduate, Temi founded and ran a book club called Neuroscience Fiction. So clearly, Molly's interest in the brain and also in science fiction and imagined futures has been a preoccupation for a while now. Since then, she's gone on to publish her first novel, which is called Do You Dream of Terra-Two? This is it here, and highly recommended. And Molly, Temi is going to be doing another session during CogX tomorrow evening on Ted Chiang's short story, The Life Cycle of Software Objects. So we might talk a bit more about that later. I'd also like to introduce Dr. Charlotte Webb. Hi, Charlotte. Charlotte is the co-founder of Feminist Internet, a non-profit organization aiming to make the internet more equal by combining art and design, feminism and technology. Charlotte teaches at UAL, University of the Arts London, where she works on a really interesting program that's part of the Creative Computing Institute at that university, where she's recently created a master's degree in internet equalities, as well as developing a 4-week online course called Design a Feminist Chatbot for Future Learn. So hello to you both, and welcome to this strange coronavirus version of a panel discussion. So I'd like to sort of frame the discussion really as a chance to talk about future positives, future dreams, and the way that the work that both of you do is engaged with hoping and thinking about new ways toward a better future. I think for me, beyond the kind of horror and tragedy that has sparked the recent Black Lives Matter protests, these protests have also somehow made me feel optimistic in the way that people are really demanding change. And I also think that it's heartening the way in which, whilst obviously we all know about the downside of what goes on online, particularly for women when it comes to social media, of course, the spread and reach of these protests are absolutely supported and in some ways enabled by the internet as well. I've also been thinking today about the young people's engagement with the Friday school strikes. That was such a big thing over the past winter, and how that kind of engagement, serious engagement with climate issues and climate change, felt again like a positive step for us to be taking. So, Temi, I'm going to start with you with my first question, really, which is, your novel, which I will wave again. Important to get these things out there. Your novel's about a group of young people setting out to build a utopia on a distant planet. So why do you think science fiction in particular is a useful vehicle for thinking about the future and thinking about our future selves?
Yeah, I guess like sort of the short answer is if you can't imagine it, then you have no chance to build it. I think about when I was around 14. I think I was about 14 when Obama was elected, and the 2 years leading up to it, so from when I was about 12 to 14, I remember watching him on TV, and I read this article somewhere saying, "Is America ready for a black president?" And even then, at age 12 to 14, when I'd only recently discovered that I'd never have superpowers like the X-Men, even then I was sure that I'd never see a black president in my own lifetime. And I think like that's one of the things about, I guess, like growing up black, growing up a woman, you're always sure about the ways that you sort of come to the world thinking, well, things just won't work out for me. It would be amazing. Won't these things be amazing? But I can't even imagine them. Even I couldn't imagine it until I saw it. So I think that's like one of the things that we can do with fiction. We're sort of building worlds that we can imagine, but also we're showing worlds that we don't want. I've been thinking recently about The Handmaid's Tale and how a lot of people have been using the imagery from The Handmaid's Tale as part of their protests against things that have been happening in America. And I think that's another example of that's a vision of a future that we don't want. And when people say, look at this policy, people say, look at this vision of the future. Do we want policies that align with that vision of the future? And in my book, I had this sort of vision of the future where it was a group of young people and they were all races. There's a captain who's black, but he's also British. And they're the ones who are sort of chosen to represent Britain, and then sort of, since they're the world, to go to this other colony. And I remember even as I was writing it, not feeling like it was a huge leap to imagine British space travel, manned British space travel, but still a huge leap to imagine. It seemed science fiction to imagine that there'd be a black captain of this ship. So I think that's one of the things that like fiction can do for us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think for me, part of the strangeness about this pandemic has been, I certainly, especially in the first month, when I felt quite fearful every time I went outside the house. And it took me a while to figure out that it was because of all the dystopian fiction and movies, etc., that I've consumed my whole life. And how, even though I know it's not rational, when I stepped out the door, part of me thought, there will be zombies. There will be, there will be.
The emptiness.
Sorry?
The emptiness of the streets makes us think zombies. That sort of vision of like capitalism, this like really populous place empty, is something that we've seen again and again in our fiction, in our movies, and in our books. Yeah. And
I think that was why I was pleased to sort of get a sense of optimism through what's been happening over the last 10 days in the protests, and just a kind of sense of even in this completely strange and very desperate for many people situation, we still want to make change. We still want to move toward a better future. Charlotte, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your own efforts to help us think about how to make the internet a more equal space, and how you think the internet can continue to transform our world for the better. I mean, obviously, there's been lots and lots of positive things that have come about because of the internet. But at the same time, we're all very aware of algorithmic bias and the kind of dark side of social media for one thing. So can you talk us through what you feel optimistic about in terms of the internet?
Sure. Yeah, I just want to say one thing following on from Temi's response to your question. When we were preparing for this panel, I just kept on thinking about the Orwell, make Orwell fiction again phrase, which you can buy as a cap or a bumper sticker. And I guess I was thinking along similar lines of sort of the warnings fiction can give us about the future. And there's some really extraordinary threads on the internet discussing what that phrase means. And obviously some people read it in terms of sort of surveillance capitalism and, the fact that we're kind of living in this dystopian future that he predicted, where we would be constantly surveilled and fed propaganda and stuff like that. So I just wanted to kind of say that I'd been very aligned in thinking that way, from a different sort of perspective. But in terms of positive change and how the internet can sort of fight oppression, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that in and of itself, the technology can't do it. We're in a constant sort of feedback loop with technology, so it shapes us as we shape it. And when we see injustices emerging through technologies, we are seeing the amplification of injustices that exist in the world. And so it's really people that have to fight oppression and do that very non-technological work of examining themselves and educating themselves and challenging injustices offline. But with that said, of course, the internet can be an incredibly powerful force for positive social change. I mean, just I guess a few ways that we can think about it. Firstly, access to information. I mean, obviously, that's very transformative. And as access increases, that transformative capacity grows. Although even we're seeing now COVID highlight how much inequality there is in relation to internet access. Even within regions, there are huge disparities, and they're causing unequal access to education, for example. And so it's the way that the pandemic sort of highlights existing inequalities. Another kind of positive thing, as you've already mentioned with the internet, is the way that it's able to facilitate activist work. So whether that's, fundraising or lobbying, community building, hacktivism, it's got lots of potential for organizing. We're obviously seeing that now with the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think although there can be a degree of sort of performativity and virtue signaling to watch out for, that the overall the internet can be a really positive space for activism. Obviously, it can continue to connect people and give them access to support services. So one of my favorite responses to COVID-19 has been Chain's trauma resilience course, which they made in 7 days, and it's delivered through Telegram. So, there's so much potential to support people that are experiencing difficulties by using the internet that I do remain hopeful about it, even though, as you say, we see so much problematic behavior and so many problematic inequalities reproduced by the internet. I believe in its potential.
Temi, what about you when it comes to how you've used the internet during the coronavirus crisis? Have you found it a source of culture? Have you found it a political space? Have you found it? I mean, we all have Zoom fatigue. That goes without saying.
I feel like the word Zoom will bring me up in hives. Yeah.
Beyond that, as you know, as a writer, as a fiction writer in particular, what's been your experience of the online space during this period?
I mean, it's hard to say because as a fiction writer, work that I mainly do in this room, my life hasn't actually changed that much. So yeah, I do remember that I've read this book just before, it was sort of like around December last year, called Skin. I have to try and remember the author, but it's a story about a pandemic where if you touch someone else, you die. And so huge amounts of people die, and everyone else has to basically quarantine themselves in their rooms, but like, again, quarantine themselves from their family. So they'll have Zoom dinners, and there are mothers who haven't seen their children for years. And that book just kept coming to my mind in the beginning of this pandemic. I think that's sort of another time where sort of fiction amplifies our fears. I think it's quite frightening to imagine the way that we're living now sort of continuing. I don't know, it's hard to say, because a lot of the things that have been happening with the Black Lives Matter movement, I have seen happen online, but I don't know if that's just because everything that I see happen at the moment I see online. So yeah.
Are you talking a bit there about the filter bubble problem and how we just see what we see people who we're already connected to? So we have this because of the filter bubble, we have this very kind of skewed view of the world and might not hear about all the opposition to our particular point of view.
I think that is true. Yeah, as well, the sort of echo chamber that we have, and and I think a lot of the problems that we might have had with the internet during this time, obviously, hugely amplified because of our reliance on it as well. So yeah, I will be interested to see. I think I'm more interested to see how this will change us when we come out of lockdown. And
yeah. Charlotte, what's your feeling about that in relation to this period now? Do you think that do you see any change to that particular problem, the filter bubble problem, or is it just the same? I mean, I thought what you said earlier about how the internet is not a tool to fight oppression; it's people who need to fight oppression. But at the same time, the internet does exacerbate situations through filter bubbles, etc. So what's your current thinking on that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'd sort of make a similar point in the sense that you can, as a human being, challenge the filter bubble from your own space by just simply choosing to subscribe to a wide variety of sources of information. Obviously, algorithms do their own work to create that kind of echo chamber, but it's that sort of feedback loop between what you choose to engage with and how you sort of populate your feed, as well as what the algorithm does.
But I do think, sorry, I do think that happens in our lives as well. I kind of see this as another example where something on the internet is just reflecting something that happens in our lives. I think like we do have a tendency to read the newspapers or read the books that amplify the things that we already believe, and to spend time with the people who amplify the things we believe, or sign up to causes, volunteer for causes that are the things, and then that's how we meet other people. And so I do see that just like the internet once again kind of reflecting what's happening in society.
Yeah.
And I think for me personally, as a writer, but also as a reader, that is something that fiction can shift a little bit. That I mean, perhaps this isn't true. Or this is a question really, is are books as prone to the problems that we're talking about with filter bubbles as news online is? So I mean, to me, that is the great thing about reading, is the way it can take you to other worlds, whether it's literally another world, like in your novel, Temi, or if it's, just an experience that's completely different from your own. And I think that is why lots of people read. So any thoughts on that aspect of what we're talking about?
I mean, I think that books are also as prone to that problem because you'll read the books that you know about the authors who agree with you, and then there are huge movements to sort of distance yourselves from authors whose views disagree with yours. And then there's also a whole culture around literature, which I love and I'm so grateful to be part of, but definitely sort of reflects, I mean, I've noticed, at least in the UK, slightly more maybe left-wing. I think people who really enjoy engaging in the sort of literature culture might consider themselves slightly more like, I guess, progressive on certain issues. And I don't know, it is another way of people talking to each other. I mean, I don't know, with this problem, I find it quite hard to think of a solution because everyone in their bubbles feels like they're right and that they're surrounding themselves by people who are right. And so yeah, I think it's sort of personally uncomfortable when you challenge that. And
yeah, no, that's very interesting. Charlotte?
Yeah, another thing I've been thinking about a lot recently is Ruha Benjamin and her work around race after technology. She talks about how so many people are living inside the imagination of others. And
what does she mean by that?
So she's kind of talking about like the fantasies of elite Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and engineers who kind of fantasize about efficiency and profit. But she sort of talks about how monopoly for some is misery for others. And so I guess I was thinking a lot around kind of technology development and acts of the imagination. So like there are some sort of fictions involved in technology development at times, like even, for example, just thinking of personas, imagining people that might use the technologies that you build. And those types of personas can have so many assumptions and biases kind of baked into them that the products and services don't serve people equally. And so I just think, for me, when I started to think about fiction, and I kind of really felt some sort of connection with what she's trying to say about the imagination being this kind of contested territory, not something that we should take as a sort of given space. So it's sort of the way that fictions are kind of political acts or politicized forms of imagination or something like that.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. And I think, Temi, what you're saying is really the kind of fundamental problem that we face as a culture around the kind of anecdotal decline of reading, and the fact that I'm not trying to say that reading is the form of culture that all people must partake in. What I'm trying to say is that there are there's a whole lot of people out there who don't read, and what can we do to try to bring people into reading? And is that something that we think is important to achieve, or is reading in a way a 20th century activity when kind of peak publishing took place, and the rise of the paperback, etc., which did make reading more democratic in the 20th century? Are we shifting away from reading with the rise of visual storytelling, the rise of visual media? And if we are, does that matter?
I mean, obviously I'm biased because I would say that it matters. One of the things that is wonderful about reading is that it's sort of the closest we'll ever get to the lived experience of someone else, to like living inside their consciousness, which is different from, I mean, like films definitely are good at like showing a certain point of view, a certain world, but like with reading, you're seeing through someone else's eyes. It's an act of really sort of like extreme empathy. Like I remember when I was younger, one of my favorite books was Catcher in the Rye. I remember when I was 15 and reading the book and just thinking, this person understands what it's like to be me. I've lived inside this person's life, and it's like a different gender, different race, in New York, a different time. But that's one of the wonderful things that reading can do. It shows us sort of our joint humanity, which is kind of what everyone is, that sort of underlies what we're talking about with feminism, with Black Lives Matter, is that like we all have this really sort of vivid, rich inner life. and experience. And it's not so different from other people's, and so we should be treated, you know, in a similar way. And I guess like that's a way of that's the closest we'll ever get to experiencing that, unless neuroscience makes some huge leaps.
Yeah, like the kind of psychological depth that fiction can bring that really no other form can do. I mean, other forms do it in different ways, but fiction can do it in a very specific way, which I was reminded of with the dramatization of Sally Rooney's novel Normal People, because for me that novel had such psychological richness to it that of course is absent in the television. Whatever you think about the television drama, which is much loved as well, that kind of inside somebody's head, you can't do that on screen, and that is what fiction can do. Charlotte, what are your thoughts about the importance of reading? I mean, thinking about the internet, which for, you know, its first however many years, 20 years, really was a reading and writing forum. Most of what you saw on the internet was text-based. And of course, with the advent of video streaming, YouTube, et cetera, that is really changing now. And visual forms of storytelling are really much more prevalent now. And in some ways, just much more democratic and open as well. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really want to just pick on that issue of empathy, which I'm so happy to hear you talk about it that way, Temi, because we really often in the sort of feminist tech space talk about the need to have empathy through not kind of generalizing about people's experiences, you know, when you're doing user research or something like that, not making assumptions. And I guess I really hadn't thought about the function of fiction in achieving that same goal. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. And also I was thinking about the potential of VR to kind of bring about empathy. And I'm thinking specifically of projects that simulate the experiences of people that you might not be able to meet yourself, like the experience of somebody who's incarcerated in America, for example, and people going and kind of really living in this kind of embodied simulation of somebody's experience in order to, you know, highlight their empathy for those groups. So yeah, I thought there was a really interesting relationship there. And then in terms of sort of a shift, I guess towards visual culture, I mean, one of the things that I think is really important to consider around it is actually, as you touched on earlier, Kate, the environmental impact of our sort of image saturated culture, because the streaming of video, for example, is like having such a huge impact on the environment. Like, you know, the porn industry is a major contender, you know, sort of in terms of carbon emissions. So I last year was working with a really great agency called Normally to look at the idea of designing an ecological Alexa. It's a very speculative project, but one of the sort of creative works they produced was like a prototype of Instagram without the images. So you would basically have a text description of all the images in Instagram, and you could choose if you wanted to see an image or not see an image. And I just thought it was such a beautiful gesture towards thinking about this kind of wider ecosystem that we live in of sort of image saturation and the relationship that has to the environment.
That's so interesting. That sounds really interesting.
It was an amazing piece.
Yeah, especially the thing you were saying as well about VR as like a way of sort of window into someone else's mind as well is really interesting. Yeah. Though, well, I've been thinking recently, that a lot of the questions that, especially right now, the right now we're tackling a pandemic, and I remember thinking, this feels so science fiction, it's so strange. But someone that I know who's an art historian had reminded me, this is actually quite normal in like the range of human experiences. Like, we've lived in this brief bubble of time where pandemics are something we don't have to worry about. But I think you might have seen all of those sort of memes that were going around, like Shakespeare wrote King Lear during quarantine, and it makes you realize how it was just a fact of life, plagues and huge amounts of people dying of something. And like, we in the West, but also in this brief time period, have kind of been shielded from that reality. And it got me to thinking about how a lot of the problems a lot of the questions that history is asking us aren't technological or medical. They have to do with like government and society, and they're about inequality, and they've always been around, these problems, and technology hasn't, and I'm not convinced is going to get us out of having to solve them in the old-fashioned way, I guess.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, Temi. And one of the things I've come across in our I'm involved with a couple of big research projects where we've had to completely change what we're doing because of the shutdown. And one of the things that it's made us really aware of is that we've got a couple of projects that work with people who will not be coming out of isolation anytime soon, and also who were probably very socially isolated before the coronavirus pandemic hit us. And so we've been trying to think about, how do you engage, once the shutdown begins to end, and once we start to come out of our houses again, how do you keep those people with you? And how do you do work and create events and just function in the world in a way that enables people who are isolated for a myriad of reasons to participate more on a more equal footing? And for me, that's really just been a big eye-opener, really, for me, in terms of thinking about the benefits of having to do everything remotely, and the way that it's made all of us think about, okay, there are people for whom this is a day-to-day reality all the time.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Charlotte, can you tell us a bit about your creative computing, the Creative Computing Institute you work in University of Arts London, and what kind of students that attracts, and what are the kind of things that your students in particular are interested in?
Well, the Creative Computing Institute, it's relatively new. It's an institution that sits in Camberwell, but it's actually a university-wide institute. So there are a range of courses there in creative computing, and one of the ones that's really interesting is actually a diploma which allows students who are already on a creative degree at the university to take a year out to come and do creative computing and then sort of take it back to their discipline. And for me, that's one of the most exciting courses, because you get this really fruitful interdisciplinary kind of mix. So people might be coming from photography, they might be coming from curating and criticism, or they might be coming from fashion. And so it's a kind of very fertile territory for seeing how creative computing can kind of refract an existing discipline. The MA Internet Equalities course, which I developed, hasn't started yet, so I can't talk about the students on that course.
As somebody who's thinking about technology and the future, what's your own relationship with technology like?
Well, so I suppose there's my sort of personal relationship and then my fictional relationship. I studied neuroscience as my undergraduate degree, and I remember sort of feeling like a lot of the things we were learning about made me consider it's kind of sort of the ethical implications, the implications for what it means to be human, what it means in a society where certain kinds of technologies are widely adopted. For example, I was reading about people who are in comas, and how some scientists have been trying to use fMRI to communicate with those people. And they ask them questions like, are you comfortable? Are you in pain? are you happy in this situation? Do you want us to turn off life support? Do you want us to try and resuscitate you in this situation? And there are huge ethical questions, and I thought fiction is a really good way to try and explore those kinds of things. So I sort of, my personal goal is to look at technology and then try and ask those questions about where does this fit in this kind of society that we want to live in. And then on a personal level, I think that writing's actually quite old-fashioned. Recently, I was buying a new laptop, and I was trying to explain to the the man at the shop what I need my laptop for, and he was like, "Oh, it has this REM and it has this processor and this graphics," and I was like, "That's like using a rocket ship to go to the corner store." It's quite simple the thing I need to do. So, yeah. So in that way, I don't know how different my process is from other people.
I was asked to bring Alice into the discussion now. So Alice, questions from you?
Hi, everyone. Hi. Yeah, I've been asked to kind of field a bit of a Q&A for all of you, just to wrap up, because we've got about another 20 minutes. I think this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, ultimately about how we can connect with others. I think in an era with technology, these connections have been so fleeting. And perhaps what you were trying to get at with that discussion around echo chambers and literature was how we can have a more involved relationship with people outside of our audience, so we get the context of where they're coming from and not necessarily this aggravating snapshot that might seem so alienating and confusing to us. I'd also just really love to talk to you about the medium. I mean, Temi, there you just started talking about the fact that you think writing is old-fashioned. I'm just so intrigued about where you think the line is between being a writer of fiction books and a filmmaker and a game maker in a technology-driven era. And I don't know if, Kate, you've been thinking about that as well. For me, this opens up a whole new kind of artistic endeavor as being someone who can maybe switch between all those lines. I don't know if that's something you could comment on. Well,
one of the things that I really loved when I was in university, I watched this film called Primer, which is a science fiction film about a group of brothers who discovered time travel, and it was shot on it was a shoestring budget. I think it was definitely under like £10,000 or $10,000, and but it was an amazing story, and it was about time travel, and they hadn't used CGI. And I think it sort of showed to me that even like with games, with films, the most important thing is story. And that's the thing that we latch onto. That's why Game of Thrones, for example, everyone was so excited about the first season because it's an amazing story. It's really complex. The characters are compelling and multifaceted and nuanced. That's sort of the bit that everyone latches onto, and I suppose it is amazing having the CGI, and it's such a joy as a fan of science fiction to watch all of the things that is capable for us to do, like 10 years, like in the past 10 years in film and technology and games. But sort of the backbone of all of those things is storytelling, and yeah, I don't think that really changes.
Kate, what do you think? Could you see yourself being a game maker in the future?
I've done some work in games, and I've done some work in film and TV as well. And I think they all have a very different skill set. I agree completely with Temi that it is all about storytelling and also creating compelling characters and story worlds. But yeah, writing for the screen is very different than writing for the page. And just because you're good at one doesn't mean you'll be good at another, sadly.
That's true.
Yeah. But I also think that, it's part of what makes us human, and that if the internet collapsed tomorrow and all the books disappeared and all the film and television we've ever made disappeared and the theaters closed as they are now, etc., we'd still just keep telling stories. We'd still just keep producing culture, regardless whether we have the buildings or the technology. And for me, that's a positive thing.
Absolutely. What a what a fantastic snapshot, because you're right, culture exists without technology. Even though we always talk about these days about digital technologies, ultimately technologies have always been fire, the wheel, and these have always inspired us to think in new ways and think about different ways of us being human. I don't suppose that, Charlotte, you could kind of, I mean, we've spoken about The Handmaid's Tale, which has been such an instrumental part of feminist thoughts, I suppose, in the last kind of 4 years, about feminist protest in particular. I don't suppose that you could kind of talk a little bit about that relationship between isolation and equality a little bit more. I really loved that point that you brought out there, which was the idea that being isolated is kind of a mark of not being equal. And whether or not you'd explored that in any of the work that you'd been doing with your chatbot or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the isolation is, again, a mirror to existing inequalities. So, you know, I heard somebody say the other day, people are saying we're all in the same boat, but some people are on a yacht and some people are in a rubber dinghy. And it's like that, you know, sheltering in place is of course what everyone is doing, but we have to investigate what that place is. If the place is not safe because you're a victim of domestic abuse, your experience of sheltering is not going to be the same as if you're in a safe, calm place with a garden. So I think, again, it's looking at the sort of the affordances of the isolation and how they relate to who you are and where you are and what other struggles you're facing in the world.
It's fantastic because you think about science fiction. Science fiction is something which brings you outside of yourself and is kind of, you're no longer physically located where you are present. And that's what literature does as well. And that's also what this pandemic is doing to us, is it's forcing us to reconsider our relationship with the physical and the, I suppose, mental or cyber space area, or whatever you want to call it. We've only got a minute left. This has been such an interesting discussion, and three absolutely fantastic women who work in this area. Has anyone got anything that they'd like to say to finish this off? Any cause they'd like to promote? Let's use the platform.
The odd kind of sustaining message can really be helpful, and for me that's a really helpful and sustaining message, so thank you.
Thank you, Charlie.
That's definitely true. I was talking to my sister recently, and she was like, oh, are we ever going to go to the theatre? Are we ever going to go to plays? And I was like, well, after 1918, there was the swinging 20s. And we're in the 20s, so maybe.
Yeah, except think about what happened after the swinging 20s. It was so good.
Guys, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for taking part in CogX on the Createch stage. It's now 6:45 in the UK. I don't know where our listeners are around the world, but I think it's time for a cold drink. I think that coming up next on this stage is I think it's like a speed networking event that they're doing. So if you're interested in Createch, you're involved in all of these areas when it comes to literature, when it comes to games, visual art. I mean, creation and culture is everywhere, and it comes in so many different mediums, as we know. Then please do hang around. That's going on from 7 till about 7:45. And yeah, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you so much to CogX for having us, and we'll be back tomorrow morning at about 9 a.m. Oh, is it 9 a.m.? Check out the program. We'll be back soon.
Want access to more CogX videos? Subscribe now for free at cogx.co.